In this tutorial, we are going to cover the nested for loop. I have prepared two simple for loops over here. If I hit play, you would see that one of these for loop is drawing a row of squares for me, and the second for loop draw a column of squares. So in order to combine them together to make a gridded image, I need to use a nested for loop, and this is the basic syntax structure. So you can see it's basically for loop leveled up. And a nested for loop essentially is a for loop inside a for loop. That sounds like a mind twister, and it's hard to imagine exactly what that does. So I'm going to walk you through step by step through a pretty complex diagrams. So I hope you're ready. So the first step you want to take with this is actually starting with the first for loop. In the first for loop, we have declared a variable let x equals to 0, which is getting tested against the condition, in this case, x smaller than 2. So if let x equals 0 is smaller than 2, then we can advance into the next stage. And indeed, the console.log is printing out x as 0, right? So all that is pretty familiar territory so far. That is exactly how a for loop is supposed to work. However, because now we have another for loop nested inside the bigger for loop, what's going to happen next is this for loop is going to continue and unravel the next for loop instead of looping back. So the next step that's going to happen is the next for loop, the second for loop gets executed, and let y gets declared and initiated, and it's being tested against the condition of y smaller than 2, right? And indeed, at this stage, it is true that y is smaller than 2, so it's going to print console.log y is going to equal to 0. So keep in mind that now we have gathered two different numbers, x equals to 0 and y equals to 0. Okay, so we're going to keep going. What's going to happen next is the second for loop is going to wanting to loop back within itself. Okay, so now we're looping back to y plus plus. We're adding 1 to the for loop variable y, and it's going to come back, loop back to that second inner for loop and get tested again, right? So now y equals to 1, which indeed is still smaller than 2. So what we're gonna get is console.log will print y as 1. Okay, so now we have collected 3 different results now, and they're not symmetrical, right? So we have x equals to 0 and y equal to 0, then equal to 1. And after this step, what we're going to get here is this really dramatic movement. So what happened was that this inner for loop has satisfied, right? So once let y equals to 2, this inner for loop is going to be proven to be false. So we are going to have to take that step 7 and circle back and make this big loop going up and essentially return to our original mission, when we're at the first outer for loop, and going back to add 1 to x, which then of course make x 1, which again is smaller than 2. So it's gonna carry this process down again and print x as 1. I hope your mind is not fully twisted yet. Mine kind of is. Okay, so then what? What happens next? So x is now equal to 1, and it returns and come back to this inner for loop as if it has never met it before, right? Because remember, what happens inside a for loop stays within a for loop. So whatever happens inside a for loop gets memorized inside the for loop and executed inside the for loop. Once it gets out, it's ground zero again. So now we are at the step where x is equal to 1, and it's going to meet that inner for loop again and being like, oh, okay, I'm going to execute a for loop now. So it's going to go through that steps of like, let y equals to 0, and indeed that's smaller than 2, y plus plus, and give me another y equals to 0. And it's going to loop back that inner for loop and give me y equal to 1, right? And once that happens, once step 6 gets executed again, it's going to loop back using that 7 step again and the step 8, and realize that, once we add another x to let x, it's going to be equal to 2, which is not going to be smaller than x, so this whole for loop has been completed and the program continues running. So you can see that by using a nested for loop, we are going to get this very kind of complex multi-step result. Essentially, what it gives us in this case is that we're gonna get a x equals to 0 map onto y equals to 0 and y equal to 1, and we're gonna get an x equals to 2 map onto y equals to 0 and y equals to 1. So how does that help us? How this help us is to be able to draw a grid. Okay, so let's try to do this and proceed very cautiously. And so I am going to comment my existing code out, and I'm just gonna make a smaller sample. And I'm going to utilize my function setup to do that. Just because the draw function is a loop itself, and sometimes it just gets a little confusing to put a loop inside a loop. So I'm going to use setup since it only executes once. I'm going to try to recreate what we just went through, that mind twister diagram. So for let x equals to 0, x smaller than 2, x plus plus. And for let y equals to 0, y smaller than 2, y plus plus. So notice that when you click on one of the curly brackets, it's gonna help you find the other matching one. Make sure that you are getting your hamburger bun order correctly here. Okay, so this outer for loop has a opening closing curly bracket, and the inner for loop has an opening and closing curly bracket. They should all match to each other, and they should all be neatly sort of stacked, right, from outside to the inside. Okay, so here you go. That's our basic nested for loop here. Let's actually use console.log to test out that we think we know what it's doing, right? So I'm going to put one over here. It's going to say console.log, and I'm going to use the template literal here and say the first for loop has executed x times, and I'm going to use the same writing here and put it inside of my inner for loop. Actually, I'm gonna make some spacing here so it's a little more legible. Okay, so and in the second console.log statement, I'm going to switch it to y. So if I hit play right now, let's take a look at our console. So we get the order right? So the first thing that gets executed says that the first for loop has executed 0 time. Oh, sorry, something I have to fix something, which is the smaller the second for loop, the inner for loop should say the second for loop. Okay, one more time. Okay, so hit play. The first for loop has executed 0 time. Then it goes into the inner for loop now, right? And do that little turning movement inside. So the second for loop has executed 0 time, and the second for loop has executed 1 time, and it returns to our original outer for loop and say that the first for loop has executed 1 time, and second for loop gets smaller again, 0 and 1. So I hope that makes sense and wasn't totally confusing. And what we can do now is drawing a rectangle and actually drawing a grid based on this logic. Okay, so here what we have to do is to put our rectangle inside of our inner for loop, and I'm going to say rect 100 times x, 100 times y. So we're utilizing both our x and y variable here, and 100 for width and 100 for height. If I hit, and we have to take off our background or else it's just gonna wash over. So I commented out the background, and what we're gonna get is this, right? This very exciting gridded shape here. And what's happening is that we get you know, the first square is being drawn when both x and y are 0. The second square being drawn when x is 0 and y is 1. So what we can actually do to make this even more clear is we can actually display our x and y value so we can actually see it. So that might be a good idea here. I'm going to use the text function to do that. So x, again, template literal, is x colon $, opening, closing curly bracket that contains an x and y, like that. So we're displaying the x and the y value, and the position is going to be 100 times x, 100 times y. Okay, let's see what happens. Whoa! Okay, so we just have to offset this a little bit. So I'm going to add 15 to both the x and y value of my text. Right. So what we see here is the kind of like display of my x and y value whenever it's being drawn, right? So you can see that upper left is x0, y0, lower right x1, y1, and this shows the order and the combination of x and y that's producing the square in different positions. So now we have this basic example that is working. Let's apply the same logic into our original drawing here. So I'm going to comment this top part out. And I'm going to bring my background back. And I'm going to also bring my grid here back. So now we know what we know. We can actually delete our second for loop. We just really need one inside the other, right? So here I'm going to add another for loop for let y equals to 0, y smaller than 20, y plus plus. And now I just have to plug my y in here. So it's going to be y times 20. And I'm going to hit play, and that's a beautiful grid. Great. So this is the basics of how you would use a nested for loop. Try to draw different kinds of shape in here instead of a boring grid. Try to add arcs, try to add different kinds of shape, and try to offset them and see what kind of patterns you can create.